I say we're going to, of course, move on to today. The talk, of course, more about ancient Egypt. I think previously we had talked about, I think, the Old Kingdom. We were kind of getting into like the age of pyramids and how all the pyramids were constructed in ancient Egypt. And I think one of the last things I also had talked about, of course, was I went into and I discussed like the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and how that was important in translating hieroglyphic, language in Egypt, which gave us a lot of history, of Egypt. We wouldn't really know much about Egypt without their language being, deciphered, I guess. We wouldn't know anything about the kings, like the list of all the different kings, I guess, of different dynasties that are out there. So now they kind of know it, because of that and everything. So anyway, of course, we're going to, of course, continue talking about the different kingdoms. I'm mostly going to go into, like I said, the new kingdom. Although if you look at this list of the three kingdoms that's here, we mostly talked about the old kingdom. I didn't really go into the middle kingdom. It's not as powerful compared to the other two kingdoms, old and new kingdoms. But they did have the middle kingdom, which was kind of around from around the 21st up to about the 17th centuries. It's about when it's around. It mostly is dominated by two major dynasties. I think the 11th and the 12th dynasty, especially the 12th dynasty, I think was one of the major dynasties that was important with that. And under the Middle Kingdom, something that was real famous that happened, if you know about it, they stopped building pyramids because they kept being robbed and all that. And so they went away from building pyramids. Thebes, we'll get to Thebes later, but Thebes becomes kind of a major city in Egypt. It'll eventually become kind of like one of its capitals over time as a whole. And then they have like a period at the end where they think Egypt got invaded. They think sometime between the 18th and 17th centuries, they get invaded by these people called the Hyksos. So that's one of the things we're going to get into first and talk about is the rise of the new kingdom that comes in after the second intermediate period comes in. And I didn't really go into it, or maybe I did mention it before. A lot of the intermediate periods in ancient Egypt were sometimes called illnesses. I don't know if you know about this, but the first illness, second illness, third illness, they talk about it. And so all these things that kind of, I guess, lead to later the decline of ancient Egypt and all that. But I'll get more into like the new kingdom itself. The new kingdom, is like a golden age of ancient Egypt. And it's one of the two major periods of Egypt, old and new kingdoms, when really Egypt's the most powerful. But the new kingdom is when the Egyptian state is really the largest size. It's more of an empire. But let me first talk about these people that came into Egypt that were the so-called Hyksos, which I was kind of getting to a second ago. The Hyksos were a type of Semitic people. They think that lived in southwestern Asia, like around where Israel and Lebanon is today, called Canaan or Levant. It's kind of what they call it sometimes a long time ago. And they apparently invaded and they took over like the lower part of Egypt. I think they ruled from a city called Avaris, I think it was called, which is kind of like around the Delta. And there's different sources on the Hyksos. It usually pronounced Hyksos, I guess how they usually say it, which is a Greek name. But there's two different writers that kind of talk about the Hyksos. There's a writer, Manetho. I don't know if I ever talked much. I think I may have mentioned a little bit about Manetho. Was this Egyptian priest and historian that lived under the Ptolemaic dynasty. And he wrote a series of like history of Egypt that was called Egyptica, which doesn't survive anymore. It doesn't exist anymore, the actual book. But fragments of it survive through Flavius, and that should be Josephus. Oh, I can't spell that right. But Flavius Josephus was the actual writer that kind of saved it. Let me write that back on there, Josephus. And he wrote down a lot of history, I guess, what was, I guess existed back then during his time. And so he gives a lot of information about who the Hyksos were and all that through Manetho. Looks like Richard's joining us also as well. Yeah, glad to get power back is right. Yeah. Sucks not having AC and things like that. Take it for granted, don't you? And all that. but anyway, there's a different translations on the name. Like supposedly the name Hyksos meant, well, I don't know about that first one. They think usually the translation is rulers of foreign lands, I think is the more popular term. Some people say foreign kings for short, although I think the second one is actually more closer to the translation of what it is. Josephus thought it had a different translation, which I'll add. He thought it meant shepherd kings because Josephus had this theory that the Hyksos were somehow related to either the Hebrews or the Arabs, one of the two, like Semitic peoples that came in there. It may have been, how the Hebrews end up into Egypt, because apparently there's some kind of story told by Manetho about this renegade priest who rebelled against one of the pharaohs. His name was Osarseph, and Osarseph later changed his name to Moses in the story. So we're not sure if it's really the same person or not, but they think it's some kind of inspiration for maybe the Exodus story about Moses and freeing the Israelites and all that in Egypt. And they're not sure how that actually connects up with the two. But Josephus seems to think that maybe that's who they could have been related to, or they may have been somehow just came in. It's possible that the Hebrews may have just come into Egypt with the Hyksos because they kind of came from the same region and all that. So whether they're related or not, they don't know specifically. What they do know is the Hyksos introduced things like the horse-drawn chariot in Egypt, which Egypt didn't have a chariot yet. But I think they had horses either at the time. Also, composite bow was also introduced from Mesopotamia in the east, and so that they used that all as a military edge to basically conquer a part of Egypt. But Egypt was kind of divided. I think the Hyksos controlled like the northern part of Egypt, and then I guess the Egyptians themselves controlled the southern part of Egypt as well. So, but they think what eventually happened, they think by the 16th century, the Hyksos were driven out. They were kicked out, and maybe that's where the whole Exodus story, comes from, right? All the Hebrews leaving to Israel, whatever. And so they think they were driven out by this king named King Ahmose. Sometimes I'll call it Ahmose the First, I guess. And he was seen as the founder of the so-called new kingdom that came later after, and what will eventually become the so-called 18th dynasty that will be the founder of it, of course. So yeah, let's get into and talk, like I said, more into the New Kingdom itself. Like I said, the New Kingdom was more of an empire building period of ancient Egypt, at more toward the end of the Bronze Age, and so they began to expand. They weren't just like in Egypt, after that. They took over the Sudan, which is true. They controlled part of Libya. They pushed into southwestern Asia, controlling the area around Israel, Lebanon, and as far north as Syria, that the Egyptians pushed into. So, yeah, these are all the areas they controlled, you can see. So Egypt, Libya, Sudan, Israel, Lebanon, Syria. So they're kind of becoming a power in Asia somewhat as well. And the Egyptians were kind of like a rival to the Hittites, who were, like I told you before, up in Turkey or Anatolia. And so those two actually at one point, I think by about the 13th century, they actually start fighting each other to control like around Syria, etc. The New Kingdom had 3 dynasties, by the way. 18th was the one that founded, originally the New Kingdom, going back to King Ahmose, the first king. And you can see they had a bunch of other kings. There was a bunch of, you can see there's three kings named Tutmos or Tutmosis that they had. And so because of that, a lot of the 18th dynasty pharaohs were often called Tutmosis or the Tutmosids sometimes. And then you have also the 19th and 20th dynasties were often called the Ramessid or Ramessid dynasties of pharaohs because you had all these pharaohs that were called Ramses, like about, I forget how many there were, like 11, I think, pharaohs with the name Ramses, including Ramses the Great or Ramses II. And so, yeah, that's why they called them that, the Ramessids, so-called 19th and 20th dynasties. Looks like Dacian's also joining us. Hey, hope you're having a great afternoon also as well. Oh, and of course, the other thing I think we mentioned about this before, about ancient Egypt, all that. Of course, under the New Kingdom, one of the things that happened is that a lot of the pharaohs were involved in the construction of a new temple complex, which is now at Luxor today, which was the capital, the city of Thebes. And so they built this famous Karnak temple complex, which at one point they say it was one of the largest temples ever built, like 300 acres in size. Had hundreds of priests that ran it. And so it became like the religious center or religious capital of ancient Egypt. And of course, Thebes, was the cult center of the god Amun. Like I told you before about the god. The god Amun was the Egyptian state god, the one that they worshiped the most. And most of the other gods are all kind of almost like manifestations of the same god, and all that. Of course, another thing that's famous, you may have seen, of course, heard about the Valley of the Kings and all that. It's kind of like an aerial view of it right there. But you have this huge burial complex that begins to form under the 18th dynasty, where they begin burying pharaohs, in rock-cut tombs. They kind of, like I said, go away from building pyramids because of all the tomb robbing that's kind of going on. And so under the Pharaoh Tutmos the first, they believe, which was the third pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, he was one of the first to be buried in the Valley of the Kings. And there's going to be at least 62 tombs that will actually be cut into the bedrock of this area, the Valley of the Kings, right there. Right nearby, there's also a Valley of the Queens as well, which they buried a lot of the female nobility there also as well. The only female to be buried in the Valley of the Kings, as you know, was Queen Hatshepsut, of course, which they were showing the mummy of her in that little short video about that. It is a necropolis site, by the way, located in Western Thebes, is what they call that area that's kind of west of Luxor, on the western side of the Nile Basin. Part of why they built these, rock-cut tombs was to hide the treasures of these, pharaohs that they're burying. And the only thing was, all the workers, had built it, and I guess their relatives and all that, they all kind of knew, where the tombs had been built. And so they later went back and robbed them. And so, of course, today, King Tut's tomb, as you know, is one of the only tombs they found there that was pretty much intact, which is why it's famous today. Even though King Tut really wasn't known for anything much. All right, now I'm going to talk about I'm going to discuss as well some of the early pharaohs that are kind of famous in ancient Egypt. There's one, of course, that's well known that I'll talk about first, is Queen Hatshepsut. Queen Hatshepsut, of course, like we showed in a little short video, was considered one of the very few female rulers that ruled over Egypt. In fact, she's only the only major female ruler that reigned over the New Kingdom. Although, if you know about it, Queen Nefertiti, I think briefly was a kind of like a pharaoh after her husband Akhenaten died. But she was the fifth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. She, of course, was actually the daughter of Pharaoh Tutmos the first, the one I just talked about, who had started the Valley of the Kings and all that. And part of why she came to power, as you know in the video, they said that basically her husband, it's like her half brother basically, was Tutmos II. He apparently died young, and so they were going to give the throne to basically his son, who's Tutmos III. But since he was like, I guess I think he was just like just a child. She ended up basically taking over the country and becoming, the actual ruler itself. I think she was first the de facto ruler, and then she basically declared herself outright pharaoh, which shocked a lot of people, as you know, because Egypt itself has had very few female rulers. I want to say there's only been like 3 or 4 they may have had. I think there may have been one, I thought, on the Old Kingdom. I know they had briefly. Cleopatra, of course, Ptolemaic dynasty. There hadn't been too many, of course, that have actually done that. So, yeah, she reigned in place of her son. Well, I say nephew. It's like almost like a stepson, I guess, really is what it is. Stepson or nephew, basically. And she would rule like something like 20 to 22 years. 21 years, I think, is usually the average amount of years that she reigned, roughly. And she's known for a lot of different things. Like I'll talk about like some of the military economic things that she did, but predominantly the most famous thing she's very famous for is her building projects. They always talk about the famous temple of Hatshepsut, which is in western Thebes. That's the most famous thing she's known for. She also, at the Temple of Karnak, she was known for some building projects there, including raising the obelisk of Hatshepsut, which, by the way, I think is the largest or heaviest, I know, obelisk that was ever put there in Egypt. But yeah, the mortuary temple that she built was really the most famous. I've got a better picture of it right here, kind of an aerial view of it. It has been rebuilt in the 20th century. That's kind of what they think it looked like in ancient times. And it was constructed in western Thebes by this minister of hers named Senenmut, who apparently was some kind of royal official that was a steward that helped raise some of her children or something like that. And he was also some kind of architect. It was kind of like a minister of some type. And there's a kind of a debate about Senenmut, about whether he may have been a lover of Hatshepsut, because Hatshepsut never remarried, anything like that, after her husband Thutmose II died. And so, yeah, it's possible they may have been lovers. It's been suggested, I think, in that time period. It actually has a nickname. Some of the Arabs call it Deir al-Bari, which means the northern monastery. That's because it was used by the Christian Copts in Egypt. The Coptic church was used as a monastery, and they think maybe as a church as well. And so that's why it's called that Arabic name sometimes. But like I said, it's been reconstructed in modern times. Like in the 20th century, they began rebuilding it, and it's famous for its massive causeway that goes up to the second level that you can see there. And it is known, you can't really see it very well, but it is known for having there was supposedly a lot of statues on it that were of the god Osiris, the king of the dead. So it honored the god Osiris. And also, obviously, her reign, they believe, as well. Besides that, Hatshepsut was supposedly known for expanding trade. Like they were trading throughout the Middle East, Eastern Africa, like the Horn of Africa, here around maybe Somalia, they think, or Ethiopia, called the land of Punt or Punt. So she was involved in that. Also, they expanded, they think, into like the Sudan. And I think under her, they began to push, under her and her son, or nephew, they began to push into the Levant as well, because after she died, her nephew took over as pharaoh. He reigned for roughly, you can see, another 40 something years. He was in power pretty long time, Thutmose III. He was a pretty good conqueror. He was known for his conquests in like Sudan, conquering part of the Levant as well. Somebody called him Egypt's Napoleon, I think is one of the nicknames of Thutmose III, but they think he may have been the one that may have defaced a lot of the monuments of Hatshepsut, because a lot of her, like I said, a lot of her monuments were defaced. Her statues were even buried and things like that. And so I guess he was kind of jealous of her, what she had done previously. But they think under her and under Thutmose III, that Egypt began to expand more into a larger empire overall. Now, I'm going to also talk about this other pharaoh that's kind of well known right after this period. You go into the 14th century, and they have this other ruler named Akhenaton, who also goes by the name Amenhotep IV, he's called. And apparently the Egyptians had a nickname for him. They called him the Heretic. It was one of the names he was called. And I'll kind of get into why he was called that. But he was hated so much by the Egyptians that they struck him from the record of kings in the 18th dynasty. That's bad. Apparently, Akhenaten, whose originally was known as Amenhotep the Fourth, was famous for starting this radical religious cult in ancient Egypt, which was based on the god Aten, which Aten was a type of sun disk god, which had been around since going back to the Old Kingdom. It was an ancient god, and it wasn't really that important. And so under Akhenaten, he tried to kind of take this god and replace the god Amen with the god Aten. He thought that the cult of Amen had too much power, and the priests at the Temple of Karnak, it was like almost like a theocracy. And so Akhenaten was trying to kind of give himself more power, behind the throne, and also kind of create kind of a monotheistic type religion based off of just that one god. So what he did, if you know about it, he took his name, Amenhotep, and it became Akhenaten, which Akhenaten in hieroglyphs means the living spirit of Aten. That's what it meant. And then what he did was he abandoned the city of Thebes, which Thebes was kind of like had been like a capital at that point in Egypt, or becoming a capital. And he created this new cult center in what is Middle Egypt, kind of halfway between Cairo and Luxor today, which became known as Akhenaten. It was called, which Akhenaten meant in hieroglyphs, it meant the horizon of the Aten. And it was this mud brick city that he built in just a matter of just a few years, like real fast. It was actually, they say it was one of the largest cities ever built in ancient Egypt. And for a long time, the Arabs called it Tel El Amarna. And so often Amarna is one of the nicknames they called his capital later. And so the period when he rules from there is often called the Amarna period in ancient Egypt, but it was a very brief period, when he was, of course, in power. You can look at a lot of images of an Akhenaten. He's kind of strange looking. They think he had some kind of birth defects, and that's why he kind of looks the way he does. A lot of it's from a lot of the inbreeding that's kind of going on within the royal families of Egypt. A lot of times they'd have the pharaohs would have multiple, wives, and the children from that would marry each other, like the daughter marry the son and things like that. So that's why the half brothers marry the half sister and things like that, which obviously causes defects, because of the inbreeding going on. Also, another thing about Akhenaten that's famous, he had a very famous wife. You may have heard of, named Queen Nefertiti. I think everybody's heard of her. She, of course, was his main consort. Of course, they believe that Akhenaten had, multiple wives, etc. They believe she was a famous advisor to Akhenaten, like when he was on the throne. She probably was involved in the Amarna cult with the god Aten as well. And they think that when he died, they think he died of natural causes, they believe, that she kind of briefly ruled as pharaoh for like a few years, like 3 or 4 years, around the 1330s BC. So she is considered to be one of the most beautiful queens of Egypt, they say. Supposedly the name Nefertiti means the beautiful one has come, or something like that. And of course, what's famous, if you know about it, is they found the famous Nefertiti bust, which you're looking at, that was found around 1912 at the Amarna site in kind of like Middle Egypt. It's now in Germany. That's kind of a controversy about that too. In fact, the Germans have that bust because the bust of Nefertiti is one of the most famous images from ancient Egypt. That and I guess King Tut, right? And the famous death mask and all that, and I guess the Rosetta Stone too, also. But anyway, they think what happened was after Akhenaten died and she died, pretty much the cult after that reverted back to what it was before, the old religions. So yeah, it didn't work. The so-called cult of Aten, of course, that he tried to create, it eventually failed, more or less. Now, of course, they have another pharaoh that comes in afterwards, which is real famous. I'm going to, of course, get into today and talk about, of course, and that's King Tut. You, of course, see in his famous death mask that you're looking at right there, King Tut. Yeah, so following the death of Akhenaten, you've got the reign of Tutankhamen, often called King Tut for short, and it's under him that they revert back to Thebes. Thebes becomes kind of like the capital again of ancient Egypt, especially where the cult of Amun, is pretty much predominant as a whole. King Tut, who's a 14th century king, was not really known for a whole lot as a ruler. He was only reigned for 9 or 10 years as a ruler of the 18th dynasty. In fact, they consider him to be one of the last major pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, at least direct descendant. And because of his brief reign as a young boy, he's often given a nickname, as you know. He's often called the Boy King for short. And he wasn't really known for much. I think they seem to think that he probably came to the throne around maybe the age of 9, maybe died around 18 years old. And he's primarily known for the restoration of Egypt's cults, the capital of Egypt, Thebes, which mostly was done by a lot of his ministers that were under him, that were probably more powerful than he was. Now, of course, as you know, the thing that's famous about King Tut is the fact that, as you know, in 1922, almost 100 years ago, I guess next year, you have, of course, the discovery of King Tut's tomb. He's really more famous for his tomb than really his life in the Valley of the Kings. KV 62, by the way, is the tomb number, of course, for King Tut's tomb. The reason why the tomb is so famous of King Tut is because of the fact that it was found intact. Like most other tombs had been pretty much, like I said, robbed before. And there's a lot of theories which I haven't gone into yet about King Tut. There's different theories about his death. I don't know if you know much about that. It's kind of a controversy today still about like how he died. There seems to be two main theories. First, about what killed King Tut. One is they think he died of some kind of illness, which a lot of it may have had to do with like a lot of inbreeding. That of course was, like I said, in the royal family. So he kind of had different things. I think he said they had a club foot. I know Tut. He had. They think he had epilepsy. Has been put forth too. It's a theory. He may have suffered from malaria, and they also found some kind of leg fracture in one of his legs. Also in the back of his head, they found some kind of fracture also as well, which they think either was from an accident or the other theory is that he was murdered. It's been also put forth, which I think they're still not sure which it is of how he died. They do know that afterwards his ministers took over. There was and then they had Horemheb that ruled afterwards, that had been ministers under him. And so that kind of helped in the 18th dynasty afterwards. I think some people put forth that maybe the Pharaoh see there AY, may have killed him and took over, but they're not sure exactly. But what they do know is that they put this tomb together pretty quickly. It's a very small tomb that was built in the Valley of the Kings. Here's kind of the 4 chambers you can see that were part of it. Whether it's for him or for somebody else, maybe originally this particular tomb, it's not certain about it. But for thousands of years, nobody had found it. Of course, it was a big mystery. I think people had known he was a king or kind of seen him in like a list of kings of the 18th dynasty, but nobody had been able to find the actual tomb itself until Howard Carter did in November of 1922. Howard Carter, if you know about, is a very famous British archaeologist. He was known for a lot of other discoveries in ancient Egypt, and he was involved in excavations where he was. There was a man named I'll get to it in a second. There was a man named Lord Carnarvon. He was named George Herbert. He actually backed a lot of Carter's archaeological excavations. He put up a lot of the money in it. And so Lord Carnarvon was the one that was really the guy that was behind the whole, finding of King Tut's tomb. And Carter was the main archaeologist that was involved with the excavation digs, which, by the way, took years because they started right before World War One. And it took them like years to find it. I think World War One kind of interrupted it, and eventually after the war, they eventually went back to Egypt and eventually found it and all that. But like I said, King Tut's tomb was like the only one found, intact. Like it wasn't. I think it may have been broken into at one point, but it was sealed back up. But it's the only one that, of course, hadn't been robbed out of the 62 tombs, which is pretty amazing about that. So yeah, the tomb was open. Of course, they found a lot of treasures, of course, within the actual tomb. Of course, the most famous thing they found, of course, was King Tut's mummy, still in his coffin. You can see there. Also, the most famous thing really about King Tut is the death mask that you see right here. I'm going to show you a quick video, of course, on King Tut in his tomb, which, by the way, is King Tut's tomb is a very big, tourist attraction, in modern Egypt today. Still is, and people are still intrigued about it.
It's been almost a century since the tomb of Egypt's King Tut was discovered nearly intact. Since then, most of the tomb's treasures have been secured in museums. But the tomb itself has become a popular tourist attraction, and that's meant plenty of wear and tear. This week, Egypt marked a milestone in the preservation and protection of the site. Roxana Saberi has the story.
As the world's most famous pharaoh, King Tut has attracted millions of visitors to his tomb, but at a cost. Dirt, decay, and scratches on the walls.
There's the graffiti.
So for the past decade, a team led by the LA-based Getty Conservation Institute has been hard at work, renovating the more than 3,300-year-old crypt. It's the first major renovation since the 1920s, when British archaeologist Howard Carter discovered the site in Egypt's Valley of the Kings. As King Tut turned into an international sensation, tourists thronged to his tomb to see the sarcophagus and mummy of King Tut himself.
A lot of visitors since nearly 100 years now. Nearly 100 years. 1922, the tomb was opened. It was sealed more than 3,000 years ago, and when it was opened, it was an environmental shock.
The conservators have cleaned and restored the paintings showing the life and death of the pharaoh, while leaving these spots caused by fungus that's no longer spreading.
It is impossible to remove the brown spots without damaging the paintings. So for us, there's no question, we cannot remove them.
They've also put in barriers and added a new ventilation system to reduce moisture and dust. During most of the repairs, the tomb has stayed open, but work was delayed by the Arab Spring in 2011. With the political upheaval came violence and a collapse of Egypt's tourism industry. Egyptian officials hope tourists will return now that King Tut's tomb has returned to its ancient splendor. For CBS This Morning Saturday, Roxana Saberi, London.
Interesting.
So a short little video there on King Tut and his tomb, which I guess, like I said, is still popular today in modern Egypt. So anyway, yeah, it's one other thing too about King Tut's tomb I did want to mention that's kind of well known. As you know, you may have heard about this thing about the curse of King Tut's tomb. They didn't really open it until 1923, believe it or not. And so apparently there was unexplained deaths, like right afterwards. People started dying afterwards. I think 20-something people that went into the actual tomb died mysteriously, including Lord Carnarvon. I told you about that helped, back the excavations and all that with money. He died of they think of an infected mosquito bite. They think there's some cases where some people walked in the tomb, they die the next day. So it's kind of weird about that thing, but they're not sure what caused it. It could be anything from natural causes to bacteria, viruses that were in the tomb. I think some people even claim there was some radiation that's like, I think want to say like natural like uranium or something that's in the actual soil or desert sand that actually caused it. But nobody knows about that, for sure. So it's kind of a mystery about it. Years ago, when I was a kid, I actually saw King Tut's, like, his actual mask and all that, which was touring America years ago. So I've actually seen it. It's pretty amazing. Also, let me also share a few other things with you too, as well. Yeah, he did have a wife. Queen Akhenaton was a wife that he eventually married. Things like his half sister, related back through Nefertiti. They had 2 children, but they apparently died after being born. And so King Tut did not have any actual children that could take the throne afterwards. So that's why his ministers took over afterwards in Egypt. Actually, there were 3 coffins they found that of course, King Tut was laid to rest in. These coffins, by the way, weighed somewhere around 200-something pounds, made of wood and gold. So that's kind of what you're looking at right here in these images. So pretty amazing. That also is the throne of King Tut, also as well, that he sat on. I guess it has his wife in the actual chair itself. All right, I'm also going to move on. We're also going to talk about as well today a little bit about another great pharaoh of Egypt, which is Ramses the Great. So we'll talk about him. Ramses is really considered to be one of the greatest pharaohs of the new kingdom. He's, of course, another part of a dynasty we've talked about before, which is the 19th dynasty. The 19th and 20th dynasties, I told you, were part of the so-called Ramessids dynasty of pharaohs they had. Really considered the greatest pharaoh, probably of all of the new kingdom. Some people think the greatest pharaoh of all time, they think. And he reigned in the 13th century. You can see there the amount of years that he may have reigned was, they think, maybe somewhere between 60 and 70 years, 66 or 67 years, how long he reigned in power. They think he came to power when he was a teenager, and then they think he died maybe 70, 80 years old when he died. There used to be a story, or an old story, that Ramses died when he was 100 or 90-something years old, but they don't think he reigned that long overall. Ramses is known for a lot of things. He had a lot of children, something he's kind of known for. I think he had something like 100-something children, at least 50-something sons overall. So he's known for fathering a lot of children. Is something he's kind of known for overall. And then, of course, as you know about Ramses was very famous for the so-called Exodus story that's in the Bible. You know about that, the Exodus story. Now, whether he's really the pharaoh that's in that story, they don't really know for sure. He's often kind of been pinpointed as the actual pharaoh. But in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the book of Exodus, they don't really mention who the actual pharaoh is by name. It depends on when Moses lived. If Moses lived in the 13th century, it's possible that it could have been Ramses, but they don't really know for sure. So yeah, he's definitely one of the greatest pharaohs in ancient Egypt, especially with the New Kingdom. And he's really the peak ruler, because Egypt peaks in the 13th century, and then after that, it kind of starts going down. He had nicknames, by the way. Here you can see he was often called the Great Ancestor. It was one of his names, and some of the Greeks also sometimes called him Ozymandias. Was another name he was also known for. He was known for his building projects. I'll kind of go through a few slides here with this, but the Temple of Karnak, he was known for constructing part of it, especially the so-called hypostyle hall, which is the largest section of the Karnak temple complex, which included, by the way, these huge 70-foot columns that you're looking at that held up the actual great hall of the actual temple itself. He and his father supposedly constructed it who was, by the way, the pharaoh, I think it was Seti the First. And it's like the big cult center, of course, of the god Amun at Thebes. Also, he was also known for the construction of the temple of Ramses the Great, which is at Abu Simbel, which is in southern Egypt, which is, by the way, Lake Nasser. And this was a rock-cut temple that Ramses built to honor the god Ra, but also himself. One thing about Ramses the Great, he was a very egotistical ruler. Loved to kind of brag about himself. And so he did this by building like huge monuments and huge statues of himself all over Egypt. And so if you go to Egypt today, modern Egypt, you're going to find a lot of statues. A lot of them are his that he kind of constructed. He had a favorite wife. He had numerous wives, Ramses the Great, but his most favorite wife was Queen Nefertiti. You may have heard of. That's kind of an image of her on one of the columns that's actually in the temple of Abu Simbel, Ramses the Great's temple. Also, he had another temple that's well known, you may have heard about, that's called the Ramesseum, which is on western Thebes. It was a mortuary temple that Ramses the Great built, where he would be, I guess, mummified right there. But it was also built to honor the god Osiris, because it had like statues of Osiris that were basically on the outside here. Some of the heads have been cut off, of course, you can see the statues. But supposedly Jean-Francois Champollion was the one that actually coined the name, the Ramesseum, they usually pronounce it, or Ramesseum, because they could say it too as well. So he's known for different types of temple construction in ancient Egypt. He also built some kind of huge statue of himself called the Colossal of Ramses the Great, which was built on the site where the Ramesseum was constructed. And it's actually since then been collapsed, but in Egypt they've actually rebuilt it today. So Ramses was really the peak ruler, I guess, of the New Kingdom. They do have the 20th dynasty that comes in afterwards. There is a Ramses III, who's actually a pretty powerful pharaoh in ancient Egypt. But after that, Egypt from then on starts declining in the Iron Age. It's not really a major power afterwards. Egypt's really more of a power that's controlled by other states. I think the Assyrians were one of the first to really invade and take over Egypt. Then after that, if you know about it, it was the Persians that took over Egypt. The Greeks under Alexander the Great invaded in the 4th century and took over. Then later, you had after the Ptolemaic dynasty existed, you have, of course, the Roman period. The Romans would come in and occupy Egypt. And Byzantine Empire, like under Emperor Justinian, emperors like that, they would be part of that empire as well. Then you got like Islamic empires, like the Ottoman Empire would also control Egypt as well. And at one point, in modern times, the British had pretty big dominance over Egypt up to around like World War I, World War II. And Egypt doesn't really become an actual, independent state until really after World War II. So now you have the Republic of Egypt that now controls, of course, all these antiquities that we've kind of talked about. And so, yeah, in Egypt today, it's kind of a crime, for you to go and steal or obviously to violate any kind of, historical objects that's there. But obviously, it's still kind of a problem. I guess there's like a black market for, kind of things like that, statues or whatever. That's something they're kind of trying to guard against today, as you know. So anyway, that pretty much ends my of course, part 3 lecture on ancient Egypt and the 3-part series, of course, on that. Now, before I go today, I want to remind you, don't forget, you've got, various assignments that are out there. Like I said, that first vocab assignment, you need to kind of start wrapping that up and turn that in to me. That needs to be turned in. I might give you a few more days on that. That's something you need to kind of work on and get done. First exam, of course, you have to start working on that today. That'll be due sometime late next week. which I told you that's only going to be on ancient Egypt, and of course that recorded lecture I gave you on the Phoenicians and Israelites. That's all that's going to be on it. Prehistory, Mesopotamia. I decided, of course, not to include that on the first exam, and also the study guide. I think for that, I only need the Egypt section turned in to me for the bonus points on that overall. So yeah, that will be posted today, the first exam. I should have an announcement in Canvas about it. And I'll probably send out reminders later about trying to finish up, some of these various assignments. So that's it for today. I hope you'll have a, great weekend coming up. I guess everybody's trying to recover from the effects of, Hurricane Ida. I know I'm still kind of am at this point, but hopefully things will, get better around here, and hopefully we don't get any more hurricanes. So that's it for today. Y'all take care, and like I said, have a great weekend coming up.